This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 38. The One Weak Link. The day for Thurley was one long monotony of fear, disgust, and helplessness. The windows had been finally uncurtained late in the morning, but the day was grey and dreary, while the atmosphere within was murky and foul with odours from below and the reek of the stove that kept the room slightly warmer than freezing. Zagorski remained at her captive's side almost constantly. She seldom spoke, and Thurley would never have addressed her voluntarily, since questions and pleading would have been of no avail, and conversation was impossible. As often as she encountered the ice-blue stare of the woman's eyes, she shuddered anew with repugnance and the certainty of a gross, malevolent mind behind their baleful glistening. She had found herself wrapped in an exceptionally long grey cloak, patched and dirty, but at least of wool and therefore slightly comforting, in this leaky old hovel, long before abandoned as a human habitation. She spent her time lying or sitting on the bed, or walking the few feet rendered possible by the meagre length of chain. She did not sleep again. From time to time she heard a murmur of voices, where the men below were repeatedly protesting against the delays of Madame Zagorski. Now and then the woman descended on the trio to soothe or to domineer as occasion might demand. Never for more than 5 minutes at a time did she thus leave Thurley to herself, and the girl was aware of the utter futility of attempted escape in such interim or in the glare of day. Twice she had dared snatch up her chain and try with her fingers to loosen the wires where the twisted ends were nipped and bent over on the link. She had no intention of doing more than barely prepare the stubborn splice for possible tampering later on, but even this seemed quite impracticable to fingers fashioned delicately and unprovided with a tool. On the last occasion, nevertheless, she found an edge on the iron bed where the twist of wire, being once engaged, was readily bent backward on the link. It did not break, being tough and malleable, and she barely had time to bend it once more to its former position when Zagorski again returned. There were no more opportunities to labour with the wire, and at most it was merely possible for Thurley to sit there planning how, if her chance should come, she could bend that metal prong till its point should finally snap. She planned all day at 1,000 things, impossible and even extravagant. No thought had entered her mind again of attempting a struggle with the woman. She knew her strength could avail her nothing in a combat so entirely unequal, and the noise would disturb the men. Her hope attached itself with childlike confidence to the man Pelivan hour after hour. Her only fear concerning him was that of his ability, surrounded as he was by other men, to render the necessary hope at the vital moment. She had doubts again of the arrival of the note addressed to the Duke and Robley. It seemed to her she was very far from all the world of Gotham. The note might be lost, intercepted. The day being Sunday, it might easily fail of delivery, if no one should come that night at 9. A fever of anxiety, hope succeeding doubt, eager planning for herself, and increasing dread and illness in this fetid room was flaming her cheeks and eyes. The day was so frightfully long. The unknown fate impending, and the mystery as to why she had been thus entrapped, were so baffling and frightening as the hours wore slowly on. She could not have known that Pelegrin, clever actor that he was, had tricked and deceived her with shameless duplicity, playing on her feelings and credulity to procure her note to the Duke. Yet she finally doubted even him. It was merely the accumulated despair to which she was victim, making its pessimistic inroads to her courage. She doubted everything at times, and was hopelessly haunted by instinctive alarms, as if the violence hovering in the air and lurid with murderous desire was some way communicated to her more receptive self, which could not interpret their meaning. Yet back to her hope in Pelegrin she fled, as if aware it was all she had, no matter how tenuous its substance. He had promised not to drug her coffee. If he should lie, she might be wiser to refuse the draught and take no chances. But the action, on the other hand, might readily excite the woman's suspicions, even against Pelegrin. Her fever rose with the waning of the day, and when at 5 the sun went down in a red-streaked sky, suggesting blood and fire that some way were not warm, she felt the landscape's desolation creeping coldly to her heart. She had risen from the bed so many times in the spirit of restlessness increasing steadily that she feared the woman must note her condition and pounce upon its actuating cause. With all the power of her mind's volition, she remained at peace, attempting to convey an impression of sleepiness again and dullness for lack of air. "May we have the window open for a moment?" she finally asked. "The air will be better for freshening." "It suits me well enough as it is," said Zagorski. "Once I heard of a man on the gallows who was given a glass of beer, from which he blew the froth. Someone questioned why he blew it away. He said it was not healthy, and then he was hanged." She laughed uproariously, shaking with mirth at the grimness of her joke. A sickening conviction of doubt settled at Thurley's heart. Ominous night and ominous threat seemed brooding together in the shadows that fell upon the snow-bound world and house. There was nothing to do but wait, and wait for God alone knew what. Evidence of more uneasiness increased below the stairs. Something seemed amiss. Zagorski was up and down repeatedly between the hours of 5 and 6. There appeared to be no preparations for dinner, or even a thought of eating. Was all concerned with Pelegrin, not yet returned from sending Thurley's note with his own to the young Grand Duke Karl Wilhelm. It was 7:30 when he came at last, and the news he brought was satisfactory. Dinner was served to Thurley and the woman a little after 8. It was precisely the sort of meal supplied the previous evening, in fact, part of the stew still remaining unconsumed. Coffee was provided as before, the man Pelegrin snatching at a momentary opportunity to nod at Thurley reassuringly while the cups were being placed on the table. The man had no more than retreated through the door than Zagorski was on her feet. "Pelegrin!" she called, and, following actively, half closed the door behind her as she gave him some manner of instructions delivered in Russian and barely above a whisper. Instantly, for no absolute reason she might at the time have explained, Thurley conceived an extraordinary plan to exchange her cup for the woman's. She did so before she could halt the action or reflect as to why it was done. Her heart, however, swung like a wind-swayed bell in its tower. Her hands shook as if with ague. She knew it was not with some sudden distrust of Pelegrin she had acted. She had merely obeyed some blind intuition and prompting to be doubly safe should treachery lurk in the drink. Zagorski returned almost immediately. The trifling sound that Thurley had made, transferring the heavy earthenware receptacles, had alarmed her frightfully. She was certain the movement had been heard, and the ruse would be detected. Partly to hide her confusion, partly to complete her action and force her own cup upon Zagorski, she drank the portion now allotted to herself, without even waiting for sugar. She was drinking indeed, when the woman came and resumed her seat at the table. Zagorski glanced at her only once, a grim expression of satisfaction betrayed for a second in her eyes. She had feared Thurley might refuse the coffee altogether. In the wildest flutter of excitement and fear, Thurley watched for the woman to drink. Her heart continued its tumult, which she was certain Zagorski must hear. She rose from her seat and proceeded to the bed, watching from the corner of her eyes. Below, the men left silently to proceed to an old abandoned gristmill a mile to the east of North Winnock. Zagorski drank, draining the cup to the dregs. "Horrible water, unfit for cooking," she said, as the drugged taste left some impalpable tang on her palate, and she rose and went over to the stove, renewing the oil in its tank. Then she stood above its heavy gush of heat, while Thurley, watching with blazing eyes, presently remembered that she must seem to droop and sink into sleep as before. She began the symptoms against which the previous evening she had struggled helplessly. Zagorski, attributing her sense of comfort to the warmth of the stove and dinner, crossed to the door, bolted it fast, and returned to the ruby glare, so impotent to dissipate the cold. She was watching her captive narrowly, a thing that Thurley felt. Rising, Thurley shook herself, rubbed at her eyes, and briskly chafed her hands. She staggered a little where she stood, winking her eyes in the heavy manner compelled by the drug before. Back to the bed she sank, maintaining all her show of drowsiness, and at length was prostrate on the pillow, her whole tingling being startlingly awake and trembling with suppressed excitement. The drug worked slowly on Zagorski. Sleep always came to her reluctantly and remained over long, the morning hours invariably increasing her torpor. Nevertheless, her feeling of placid contentment now rose and engulfed her lurid brain. She sat in a chair beside the stove, somewhat exulting in the thought of a good night's rest ahead. She nodded there, her sense of peace possessing all her body. Dimly she thought of 9 o'clock, and of work to be done by Jan and the others when the trap should close its jaws. What need to bother herself? When that was done, the rest could follow quickly, and then, if a flight by darkness seemed advisable, a bit of sleep to start on would be well. She rose by making an effort and moved across to her bed. An hour at the most she might nap serenely, and then she dropped herself down, or rather drooped, possessed of a sudden with a wild suspicion that something might be wrong. A flash of vivid, glaring light was seared across a portion of her brain, like a lightning stroke that fails to reach the earth. The zigzag halted in the dullness, shutting out her intellect, and faded on her night. She tried to rise, to cry to the men who were gone, as she fully remembered. She could neither lift the leaden mass of her shoulders and weighted skull, nor utter forth more than a gurgle. The sound she made was terrible to Thurley, lying there quivering with her life. It was such an animal, savage sound, as of some wild beast that struggled with suffocating death. Expecting almost that the creature would come staggering, possibly, but horribly vital and stubbornly active in her sinister intent, Thurley dared not move and dared not remain, and held her breath in fearful alarm as she listened to hear the lightest tread. It did not come. Zagorski was down, her brain like a blackened frame where fireworks, having expended their flare, die suddenly, with here and there a streak or a star of unattached and meaningless red glowing vividly a moment on the velvet gloom that its previous brilliance has intensified. She was still awake in a manner, sinking as one who drowns but is not yet wholly unconscious. Then oblivion claimed her for its own. It was not until nearly half an hour later, when the woman was breathing with the stentorious gasps and irregular percussions of a gasoline engine, that Thurley dared to move. She rose, then cautiously glancing at once toward the inert mass the woman had become. The house was still, the silence, save for Zagorski's breathing, was intense. Thurley went to the lamp and turned it low, then crept to the window and tried to peer through the snow-lighted darkness of the night. There was nothing to be seen. She had no means of determining the time, but felt it must be fully 9 o'clock, when perhaps deliverance should come. Once more at that, the clear, bright light of her reason was cast illumining upon the facts. Pellevan was a proved liar. The coffee he had promised should be harmless had been obviously drugged. Undoubtedly, all his sympathy and loyalty had been a sham. New forms of suspicion and dread rose before her vision as she thought of the uses to which her note to Robley might be put. She was terrified anew by the murky conception of some hideous network of duplicity and crime, with its meshes about her vouchsafed to her vividly working mind. She must save herself, she realized, or the blackest of fates would doubtless be her portion. Alone with the silence and the sodden woman labouring in her sleep, she stood undecided, overwhelmed for a moment with a half-clear glimpse into things appallingly obscure. Doubts as to where she really was assailed her, together with consuming fear of the creatures heard at times below. But to leave this house without the slightest unnecessary delay was the first demand of action. Quietly, furtively, she glided toward the bed, catching up the iron chain that bound her like a slave. Her hand ran past the wire link in her trembling anxiety for haste. Then she found it, and, moving it to the metal edge employed in the afternoon, bent the twisted strands upon it and began to force them down and up by the feeble glow of the lamp. It seemed as if they would never snap, so tough was their substance, so soft her hands, and so great was her fear of creating a noise that would rouse Zagorski from her sleep. In feverish desperation she strained at the wire, and was torn through the skin of her finger. Her hand was presently reddened from the wound, but she worked more hotly than before. The wire gave way. Excitedly assailing the bright-tipped strand, she pushed it and drove it back through the link that it coupled to a mate, finding it harsh and resisting to her efforts. Her hands were stabbed and cut anew, but the loosened ends were forced to yield, till presently the chain was parted, and an end fell down and struck the floor sharply. Thurley could have moaned. Zagorski started in her slumber. Some of her stubborn instincts of suspicion and watchfulness responding automatically to the noise the chain had made. End of chapter 38.